Most of the work here is from Anne's solo exhibition, Water Stories, that was at the Museum of Science, Boston. These paintings explore the beauty and foreboding of water related to central themes, mostly man-made and related to climate change. So I'm really looking forward to listening to Anne discuss some of the stories behind these paintings. Anne is an accomplished painter and printmaker who spends her time between Boston and Jonesport, Maine. She was a finalist for the Prix de Rome and was twice a finalist in painting for the Mass Cultural Council Fellowship. She has been awarded residencies at the Millay Colony for the Arts in New York and at 2 different residencies in Ireland. Her work has been shown at galleries in New York, Boston, San Francisco, and now Portland, and in museums around the country. Her work can be found in the collections of many museums you undoubtedly know well: the Whitney, the National Gallery of Art in DC, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the NFA in Boston, the Farnsworth, the Brooklyn Museum, the De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and many more. And with that, I turn it over to Anne.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kelly. It's an honor and a privilege to be showing these paintings again here, to have them have a whole different life and a whole different view. When I started thinking about what I wanted to say, I ended up thinking about many, many things to say. You never end by you never end having a talk without saying, wait a minute, I didn't say this and I didn't say that. So I might be going like this, but then on the other hand, this, because I started having an argument with myself about the idea of painting. So anyway, we're gonna talk about how I started and why I'm connected to Maine. And then I'm gonna talk about why I'm painting water and the project at the Museum of Science. And then I want to talk about being an artist and, the basics: beauty, love, hope, all that. And science and art and the process and describing the paintings. It was in the late 80s that I came to Maine. I had always come at the end of the summer with my daughter to go to a campsite in Georgetown. But I ended up getting to know this guy whose first words to me were, "I know I have a house in Maine." And I thought, gee, that rings a bell, like somebody said that about Africa. I own a home farm in Africa. Well, I married the guy and ended up spending a lot of time in Maine, and his house was in Jonesport, Maine. And if any of you know, way down east, Jonesport, Maine is a fishing village, tiny little fishing village, and it's just beautiful, stark, and it has a character to it. The people there, the natives say, they have an accent. It's a very strong and different accent. They not only say "eya," but they go breezing up, and they have language, a different language. So it was just wonderful to be immersed into that culture. So that's how I started being in Maine, and I think that Maine has altered and really made my experience of an artist just expand tenfold, 100-fold, 1,000-fold, just living in the land of Maine. So it's been extraordinary for me. About 20 years ago, I started to make paintings about water. And I think one of the things that happened to me was that I discovered aquifers. I had never, for some reason, I'd never known about aquifers before in my life. And the idea that these underground layers of soil rock permeated with water would dribble down and become a stream or a river or even a lake and exist under the land was extraordinary to me. I just thought, well, for starters, nobody has ever seen an aquifer. And I think that the idea that it was so unseen and so alive and so vital to so many parts of our water life, like the lakes that we would use to get water in the area. It just, in any area, it became very, very important to understand the idea about aquifers. The other thing about it was that you could imagine it. You know, like no one's ever seen it, so who would know? You know, if I had the right way of doing it, aquifer or not. So I had a fabulous time painting these imaginary aquifers. And then one of the guys that was helping me out in Maine, he came into my studio as I was painting a huge painting, and he said, hey, that's Mopang. And I said, what are you talking about? What's Mopang? And he then described that he knew of this beautiful, beautiful lake. And under this lake in Township 30 near Perry was an aquifer by the name of Mopang. And I thought it was just extraordinary. And he described it to me. And it's in the middle of nowhere. No one sees it, no one knows it. But then he started telling me the story about how in 1989, a company wanted to put a toxic dump right next to this. And it was just like they were going to get away with it. And finally, the citizens from Jonesboro and everywhere else gathered together, and they formed the Clean Water Coalition, and they defeated them. And it was an extraordinary event in that area. And they ended up saving all of their own water because little did anybody know that the aquifer, this huge aquifer underneath the lake, was feeding all the streams and rivers that went as far as Machias and Jonesboro. So that was pretty amazing. So when painting the Water Stories project in 2012, I started out by doing a lot of research on the issues that were facing this country. And the first thing that the museum and I settled on was we weren't going to do everything. We were just going to do issues like contamination and pollution, or climate change, or mismanagement and overuse, or water mining, aka fracking. And so we decided, okay, we're going to use these four. And two of them are here. The climate change ones have to do with within, without, trickle, drought, and that one over there called squall. So mismanagement and overuse is this one over offshore, and this one over here called lost, and that is in parentheses Colorado. So that's what I started with. And so then I just found as many articles as I could about these issues. I've been painting now for 50 years, gasp. And when I started this project, and even more currently, I asked this question of myself, you know, what does it mean to be an artist now? We look, do we look? Do we reflect? Do we look at what we see or do we reflect on our planet? Does it affect us? As landscape artists, do we think about place? Do we think a lot about beauty? Do we gaze at the beauty like an innocent child when it surrounds us? How do we converse with the world now? I say this because I have this argument that I have a continuous argument with myself about innocence and knowledge, and where are you as a painter experiencing the innocence of an idea, of a vision, of looking at something, and where do you bring knowledge into it? So I remember, so I go back in time now, and I'm remembering the place where I grew up, and I was surrounded by nature. And when I was growing up, the property right beyond my parents' property, which was on the edge of a street with, my father got 4 acres in 1942, and a very small old house, a farmhouse. And across the street was Old Man Lyon's farm. We always knew it as Old Man Lyon's farm. And so he had 60 head of Black Angus cattle and over 100 acres surrounding our property of fields. Those fields, I ran in those fields as a kid with my younger brother, skipping over the cow pies. And just, I think that was the time in my life, that early time in my life when it became dusk and the field grew to be golden, I began to really think about, I'd stop and look at it and think about beauty and think about the miraculousness of that moment, and how could I hold that? How could I keep it? And the way in which I could keep it was to become an artist, a landscape artist. And so that was my, my vision. But then I remember going back many years later to my childhood home, and the fields had clustered houses in them, and it stirred me because it made me very, very conscious of what I had lost and what could only be a memory. And I think when we think about nature right now, it's hard to describe, but I want to stand on one side here and say, I still want romantic nature. I still want it to be my nature. And then on the other side, I say, nature is indifferent. Nature is just going to proceed. And that's the way it is. So I want to just spend a moment to talk about place or home, because I think that when we feel most comfortable as artists, I think we find the place that we feel complete and peaceful. Some of us find that in photography in cities and taking pictures of people or structures. I find it, or in nature, I find it in nature. And nature has and will always be that place for me. So I was looking up some words because I was feeling very nostalgic. And I remembered that the Greek word for, that comes from nostalgia is nostros. And nostros means returning home. So that's another way of thinking about home. Nostros is also the way of a bittersweet yearning. You're returning after perhaps a long voyage. There's a really interesting book last year written by a guy by the name of Mendelssohn called My Odyssey. That's if you want to explore Odysseys, that's a good one, and returning home. So I thought about that, and I also started thinking about home. Home, the English root is ham, meaning hamlet, or area of a tribal place or a community. But then when you get into another definition of it, and you all might think, oh my gosh, she's going off on a tangent, but I'll get back, don't worry. That if you look at, in the Indo-Aryan language, the word for home is homos, which is also meant to be human made of soil and made of dirt. And so in legend and in mythology, you have humans being made from dirt and soil. And what is that but the earth, the land? And there we are again, back thinking about the land and thinking about what we see and what we look at. So when I was learning about art 100 million years ago, I was looking at artists like, beside the 1950s where abstraction and everything was bursting in this country. But I was looking further back to Cézanne and Matisse and Van Gogh and their struggles to reconstruct art and nature and the simplifying of form. Those were the old chestnuts. You might remember them. I look at them still. I look at them a lot, actually, more than I look at contemporary art. Or even before then, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Jardin, Da Vinci, the amazing air of Da Vinci, or Las Meninas, Velázquez's beautiful, beautiful painting that when you see it for the first time in your life, I cried. It just is gorgeous. So I was thinking that, I grew up with these chestnuts, these very important people. And I remember I was trying to find something that would be representational, a quote, a paraphrase from one of them. And Matisse came to mind. And he talked about how creation is the artist's true function and begins with vision. It is essential for the artist to look as if for the first time, as though he were a child. Painting must be infused with the same power and beauty that is found in nature, and to translate the artist's emotions and reactions using the artist's sensibility, the self as a medium. So how do we hold on to that innocence? He wrote this when he was well over 50. That's an amazing statement. He goes even further, and I just noticed this the other day in Jack Flam's book. I hadn't read it in years. The act of creation is equivalent of an act of metaphysical love. That love is at the root of all creation. Can you imagine always thinking about that and painting from that place? So those are things that I think about, or I have been thinking about. Beauty has always come into that category for me of observation, of love, of hope. It's critical to reveal the beauty of the earth. I felt even as a young artist, that was my goal. I felt that was the gift to the world, and I could give as a painter. And now there seems to be an added factor to it that has just slipped in, like in the back door, and that is beauty and foreboding. And it seems to now be a natural thing. Whether I consciously do it or unconsciously do it, it happens in my work. And so they go together. And to continue to love nature and to feel the way one needs to feel as a response to nature, that I have to hold on to hope. I have to hold on to renewal. I have to hold on to wishing the future in a very good way. I have to think about beauty and nature in unmeasurable terms. I can't limit myself. And I think if I feel that way, then I can paint from this place of imagination and experience, of looking and of being in this world where beauty then becomes intertwined with ideas, and in this case, about ideas about water issues. So recently, a friend of mine sent me this article by John Yao. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Hyperallergic, but it's a wonderful online magazine, and John Yao writes an essay on about Bryce Martin and his new show at Gagosian. And Bryce Martin's show is titled, I love it, Bryce Martin, it reminds me of something and I don't know what it is. I love it. I love it. It's just like this guy, I think Bryce Martin must be turning into his 80s, or at least late 70s. Anyway, Yao urges us to reacquaint ourselves with Rilke, the first elegy, which contains, there are 10 poems, and there's a line that I hadn't read before, but it's amazing. It says, "For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror that we are still able to bear." Isn't that beautiful? It's amazing. And then he continues, John Yao continues to say, art is not just for looking, but it's also, as we know, for thinking and for reflection. So with these issues around water, I began this project with the Museum of Science Boston. And the idea about science and art began to coalesce. And you know, all of you, you know that science strives to comprehend and to solve the mysteries of the universe. Well, art tries to reveal them, not solve them, but just reveal the mysteries, and is always discovering. Art backs into and always discovers these mysteries when we are in the midst of finding things out. I can't tell you how many times I would be, I'd have a piece of work up and in a place, and somebody would come up and say, "That's a microorganism that is blah, 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 blah." And I'd go, "Oh, really? That's interesting." And so there was this kind of marriage between art and science that really interested me. So when the Museum of Science asked me to work to do these, I wanted to reveal the issues, but I didn't want to paint a picture. I did not want to paint anything that was remotely like a picture. I wanted to paint an experience. I wanted to paint something that you could feel, that you could somehow climb into. That was what was important to me. And it was not important to me that you'd recognize, aha, that's the Colorado River. No, I did not under any circumstances want that. I wanted an experience of what was happening to the Colorado. So I wanted you to wander in them. I wanted you to feel hopeful. I wanted to invite inquiry. And if I haven't said it, wonder. I wanted wonder in these. So now, how did I do that? All of these paintings were started with what I call a pour. And a pour is where I mix a ton of different colors that I think about and that are related to the ideas that I have about water. And then I take a very large canvas and I start throwing the paint onto the canvas and moving the canvas around and making different forms and shapes and throwing the canvas in the air, jumping and placing it down. I mean, it's very physical and very visceral. And I move it around, I work out, I lift weights. I do that for these paintings because otherwise I wouldn't be able to move them. And then I have something. I let it dry in the sun. It's always out on the deck or on the ground where I am in Jonesport on a good day. And sometimes the wind plays a huge part in my pours. And then I let it dry, and then I bring it in, and I put it up on a wall, and some days it takes just the next day to have the idea put in place about where I want to begin, and some days it takes months or even, one of them took about a year. Actually, this one, and I'm going to tell you about that, how it happened. So then when I do that, I begin to think of a reference point or an idea. And then there are several layers that follow. And there is a joinery. For me, painting, the act of painting is joinery. Painting one mark on top of another, or one layer on top of another. That is joinery. It's a wonderful word. And what I hope to have in those moments is I try to remember the things that I've been thinking about, and somehow that wandering that I do throughout the canvas, it begins to take shape. I was a printmaker for 2 decades, and that's where I learned all of my mark making. It was a language of mark making that I just couldn't help but do when I was a printmaker. My hand was always moving. And so those were the marks that I used when I went back to painting and jumped in. Again, I love Bryce Martin's title. It reminds me of something and I don't know what it is. All of these paintings started like that, and then they took form and shape, and the inquiry, the questions I would ask the painting. Are you going to be this? Are you going to be that? This one here, this trickle drought. Of course, you know about yellow, right? Yellow is the color of insanity and brilliance. So to have this yellow, this was my golden field, my beautiful field at dusk. But it was also what happened to the fields out west, which I will tell you about in a minute. I think that when I was working on these, I borrowed heavily from history. I think I have a theory that as an artist, we're all in this river. And in this river, they're past artists, they're artists to be, and we're just all going along in this river. So there's nothing like an old idea or a new idea, they're just ideas out there that you pick up, you do. So for color and form, Van Gogh gave me the swatch of red. I'd have all these books, these history books, just wide open on my floor. Rembrandt, black. Black, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue make the most amazing, rich black. Da Vinci, soft air. I looked at Da Vinci a lot when I was doing this painting because I really wanted everything to be just almost ephemeral. And I can't think of a better painter than Da Vinci to tell me about that. Except for also the air in the room of a Rembrandt or of a Velasquez. It's also amazing. So always, and I believe this happened with all of these painters that I've just mentioned, there is a conversation between the artist and the painting, the artist and the sculpture, the artist and whatever it is that they are making. And so that idea of the conversation between me and what I began to create, it was very important. In the beginning, it was me and my curiosity and my imagination saying, what about this, what about that? But then, as the painting progressed, it came back to me. And it's extraordinary how, with time and listening closely, you can watch a painting for a day, or go do therapy shopping, and then come back and look at your painting again, and all of a sudden your painting will say, lower left, yellow, or upper right, do this. I mean, the painting tells you if you listen to it. And so these paintings are very alive to me. I mean, they help me make themselves. I'm going to focus now on these two guys here. This is trickle drought, within, without, and this has to do with climate change. The West dealt with drought so seriously when I was doing this in 2012, and it just changed the whole way farmers were dealing with their crops and their cattle. And I remember in the spring of 2013, there was just a huge bunch in the Times. There were just front pages. Once a week, there was a picture of a farmer looking devastated at his land and at his crops. And what happened was they had to change their whole way of thinking about feeding their cattle, having cattle, and they had to plant different crops for that season, for that drought. Lost here, such mismanagement, such awful mismanagement. Can you imagine a beautiful river, the Colorado River, our pride and joy, went to the sea in the 1950s, and I think also the 60s. There were three dams put on the Colorado River. And what do you expect? What happens if you have a dam damming up a part of the river? What happens is the sediment in the river shifts and changes. And it changes the way it deals with the water. And so the quality of the water went downhill, totally downhill. And it also never got, again, there was 30 miles that never got to the sea as a result of that. They've actually shifted that and changed it, and there is a trickle now that is going to the sea. But it was just so amazing to me to think about that, and how fragile and how soft. I was thinking about the tenderness of a river, and how you have to take care of it and be kind to it as a human being. And we were just looking after ourselves. We were measuring what we as human beings were responsible for and needing. So what I did was I wanted to show that, here in Lost, there are layers and layers of century of rock, and I wanted to show that. I also, I used to do this with my paintings. I put the collective colors of the paintings on, I'd stick them on, and they were my bijou, my jewels, my gems. And I just randomly placed these here to say, this rock is our jewel. Rock is our gem, and it holds this river. Anyway, I always get very emotional when I think about these things. Anyway, it's good, And then we have over here offshore, and this was the painting that I did a pour, and I said, what am I going to do? I have no idea. What am I going to do? Well, history helped me, the current events actually, because good old Dick Cheney was, he was head of Halliburton Company, and Halliburton, the company was very, very much a part of the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And actually what had happened was there was a case against Halliburton between Halliburton and Nature Conservancy, because the Gulf of Mexico, especially on the Louisiana coast, was just wrecked. I mean, animals and bird life and all the wildlife were just soaked in oil. So they were proven at fault, and they had to pay millions and millions of dollars to restore that area. Well, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, well, what the hell is a well bore? Because these well bores were the were the problems, because what happened was these pipes would be drilled into the sea, into the Gulf, and they would go right into the land. And then they go, oops, no oil here, and then they'd put a cap on it. But then some of them had oil, and they used up the oil, or they just decided that, no, we don't want to use this. And so then they put a cap on, but they wouldn't put it on tight enough. And so, you know, if you really want to be literal about this, these are all the little well bores. And, you know, kids would come up to this at a couple of times when I'd go to the Museum of Science, and there would be a kid, and I'd say, what do you think that is? Oh, it's a shell. I know it's a shell, and that's the water coming up. And I'd say, well, that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, it could be. But actually, these were my well bores. And they all had the little, you know, bloop, 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 bloop. You know, they were leaking. And it was just my way of saying, look at what you did. And everything is muddy and foreboding. And so there we have it. That's offshore. And then squall, this last one behind you there. These are both, this is also to deal with climate change. And I remember being very, very taken by this gentleman by the name of Robert Stavins. He was the director of environmental economics at Harvard Kennedy Center, and he had an op-ed in the Times that just flipped me over. And I thought, oh my heavens. He said, climate change is essentially unobservable by the public. On a daily basis, we observe weather, not climate. And it was such a powerful statement. We look at weather, we think about, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow, oh, it's going to snow tomorrow, oh, there's going to be this huge, huge storm tomorrow. But we don't think of it as climate change, like something is really off, something is really happening. So this painting called Squall was my imagined idea of a huge, huge storm just coming over Jonesport, right over the water and the lights of the you know, the harbor, and it was just going to consume us. And that was my thought about that. The last painting over there, What You Cannot See, is a more recent painting. And it actually imagines what's under the ocean, what's under, what's blending in a river, in a lake. It's just water and the imaginings of just what it would be like if I were like a fish underwater. What would I see? How would I see it? So that's what we say. That's what I say when I say what you cannot see is like what they see, what creatures see. So it's also a way of talking about beauty and hope, to keep thinking and remembering that we need to have a certain kind of hope. So that's in my closing statement. I want to just, I'm going to quote this amazing writer, and I'm totally biased. I can't help it. His name is Jonathan Franzen, and he wrote an article about climate change that was in June's either online New Yorker or in the New Yorker. And it was about 6 or 7 pages long. And it just absolutely just laid everything out for you. Like, this is what is happening. And it was just an amazing thing. So I'm just going to quote around the last 2 paragraphs of what he said, because it hopefully will make sense of all the different things that I've been talking about. Excuse me. If you care about the planet and about the people and animals who live in it, there are 2 ways to think about this. You can keep on hoping that catastrophe is preventable and feel ever more frustrated or enraged by the world's inaction. Or you can accept that disaster is coming and begin to rethink what it means to have hope. If your hope for the future depends on a wildly optimistic scenario, what will you do 10 years from now when the scenario becomes unworkable, even in theory? Give up on the planet entirely? To borrow from the advice of financial planners, I suggest a more balanced portfolio of hopes. Some of them longer term, most of them shorter. It's fine to struggle against the constraints of human nature, hoping to mitigate the worst of what's to come. But it's just as important to fight smaller, more local battles that you have some realistic hope of winning. Keep doing the right thing for the planet, yes, but also keep trying to save what you love, a community, a wild place, a species in trouble, and take heart in your small successes. Any good thing you do now is arguable as a hedge against the hotter future. But the really meaningful thing is that it's good today. As long as you have something to love, you have something to hope for. Thank you. I'm afraid it might have been a little long, but do you have any questions? I just had lots to say. Anyway, questions about anything? Yes. John.
So, one question about the pour process.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when you're doing the pour, and you said when you're mixing the paints, it's thinking about sort of the concept.
Yes.
So, is it literally, are you thinking about the Colorado River?
Oh.
Doing the pour on that, or is it sort of emerges later?
Half and half, kind of like the cream. You know, it's like you think a little bit about it, but if it hadn't turned out that way and I couldn't figure out a way to create the right kind of idea that I wanted, and I didn't know what that idea was going to be until I kept going with it. And then if it didn't work, I'd turn it into something else, if I could. Or I'd pour over it, which sometimes happens, you know. Blew that one, okay, I'll pour over it and start again, you know. Yeah,
Is
Joe.
this work a visual language that you use throughout your work? I'm not familiar with other work.
I started doing these pours, I'd say, in the 1990s, and then I really got into making paintings that started with the pours and really building up layers from 2000 to now. Actually not now. This summer, I had the most amazing summer of painting, where all my paintings were these pours, and I would spend hours, 10 hours on these pours, and then I would let them dry, and I would look at them, and the painting would say to me, "If you touch me, I'll cut off your hand." It's like, no, you cannot. There was so much restraint that I had to use, because some of them required a little, and some of them required none. It was just, one day the wind came up and created one of the most extraordinary pours I've ever done. I mean, what am I going to do? Say, it was a really beautiful pour, so who am I? I just was there to experience it and mix the color. So, so to answer your question, I keep evolving. I started off as a landscape painter that was actually painting what I saw. And it happened that when I was in Jonesport in the late 80s and early 90s, I would go up there every summer, and I had this little chicken coop that I had as my studio. And I would always, paint what I saw. It was beautiful. And finally, I started getting so discouraged because what I saw was so beautiful and what I could do was so crude in relationship to it that I just said, I can't do this anymore. It's making me sick to my stomach. And so I just said, all I want to do is just have the looking be for the looking. And it freed me. It allowed me to come from my imagination and come from my ideas and turn my whole experience of being an artist inward. And I think also I lost my innocence when 9/11 happened. All of a sudden, nothing was free, nothing was innocence anymore to me in that way. So I'm learning a new kind of innocence, the kind that Matisse is talking about, the kind that Bryce Martin thinks about when he's 80, and that's a sort of a channeling, a tunneling that you go into, and you're part of a zone that you just step into, and you're nowhere in space, and you're making art, and you're making something, and it has its own life, and you happen to be part of it in that moment. And isn't that wonderful, So that's the journey that I've taken from really painting a flower or, a sea bass or something like that to doing these things. So, anyone else? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I'm interested in what effect you think you had with your paintings being displayed in the Science Museum.
Being displayed.
Displayed in the Science Museum. And whether you, I'm a painter as well, and whether
Yeah.
you think you advance the conversation about common themes through visual.
Here's what I think. I know that over 200,000 people came through to see that show. I also there were 14 large paintings along with, this is a part that is separate from here, but I had interviews with people all over the country. And I interviewed people and asked them a few questions. I asked them, what do you cherish about water? What do you hope for with water? What do you fear for water? And I asked all different kinds of people. I was stuck on a thruway. There was a huge accident with a truck. And so all of us were standing there. I got my equipment out, and I would just go around and say, where are you from? I'd get up, I'd stand on this, the edge of a huge truck, and I would say, can I interview you? And the guy was just great, and I would ask these questions. And those questions, so some people came into the Museum of Science, sat down, and just listened to all those different things. And they were I interviewed my 4-year-old grandson. I would interview my 100-year-old buddy, who had a whole different way of thinking about, water. And then tons of people I didn't know. And then I hired a sound guy who was wonderful, and he helped me put it together. And so it would be a soundtrack that would be throughout the show. Some people came in and looked carefully. And there were also 4 or 5 explanations of what these were, saying this is, in these 2 paintings, there is climate change, or in this painting, it's overuse. And, so there was some guidance there. But what I was trying to focus on most of all, and what I was doing with the person who was in charge of the gallery, was I was trying to activate a learning muscle that happens when people who don't know much about art are standing in front of something they've never seen before, and activating that kind of what is it? The curiosity, wondering what it is, and and trying to sort of figure something out, or why they like it, or what this represents. And to me, that was, I don't know if that augmented climate change or issues. I know that we were one of the first people to do it, besides a wonderful center in Idaho that had done it the year before, talking about issues around water. I have no idea. But I do know that if anybody gets the New York Times, between last Wednesday and this Wednesday, over 4 front pages were about climate change and issues, whether it was in France or in Brazil, in the Amazon, or in California. And I'd say that's progress.
Well, where should we be so lucky to hear the audio from those?
Oh,
Is that what
I'll tell you,
I'm missing them, and I haven't even met them yet.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you where they are. They're on my website, and you just go to Water Stories Project, and then in that you scroll down, and it says, it says the, it tells about the different ones, cherishing water, and they're a riot, and some of them, and then there's one, actually the last one's about the science of water, and that's a very serious one. I did go into a fracking area in Pennsylvania, and it was just hard to hear what was going on with some of the people there that were really being affected health-wise with some of the fracking that was happening. Eloise, you had a question?
Yeah, I know you have this remarkable summer course.
Yes, you do.
Experienced a little of it. I'm interested in what happens to you when you shift places. Now, I know you don't entirely let go of Jonesport.
No.
You go down, but you're more there than you are up there.
Well, yes and no. I leave next week to go back.
I'm just interested in what that transition does to your process. Is there a yearly rhythm to it, or?
No,
It's different every year?
it's different every single year, and it's always changing, because my work is always changing. That's something I allow to happen. This summer, I had the gift of weather, and I just I took 10 or 12 huge canvases and worked on them all summer. It was a delight. And then when I got to, I got back to Boston, the loading dock that I used to work on a Sunday morning at 5:30 or 6 to do a pour, the rare ones that I did in Boston, it has now been sort of taken over because there are a lot of companies that have come into the building that use that loading dock. So I'm not able to do that. And it's something I don't do inside. I always, because it's toxic, I use oil paint. And so I always am halfway outside. Yeah, so the change comes, I write more, perhaps. I think I read a lot more. That's the time is spent more in that way. But I paint small paintings, 14 by 11. I do that. And so I just keep all the big guys
You're so
working.
not a 14 by 11 person.
Yes, I am. You have no idea what I can fit into a 14 by 11.
I just don't know that part.
Oh, you will. Anyway, are there any more questions? You actually do. I spent a year doing, I turned, a few years ago I turned 70 and went, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Should I look back? Should I think about my life? And so for about a year, I painted these paintings that were 14 by 11. They were all verticals, and they were all about my life. It was like this huge autobiography. I don't need to write a book. Who would want to read that? It was just perfect. It was absolutely perfect. So I got it all out of my system. So, yes, David.
Those were imagistic.
They were. Actually, I had a character. And they ended up being shown in New York at this foundation called the Q Foundation. And it was titled, wait, what was the title of it? It was so funny. It was like, oh, In Plain Sight. It was like, there's a saying called In Plain Sight. You know, like, it was so obvious after I turned 70 that I had been hiding behind my paintings my whole life. So it was like, you know, and everything was sort of structured around that. So I had this character of a paint stick, and I used the paint stick as a character to show my disgust with the environmental issues. That was called The Scream, and there were other paintings that were similar. But there was a character, and I felt compelled at that point. The only time in my life I felt compelled to have a character, except for when I was a landscape painter.
So what are the new ones like? Are these still?
The new ones are huge. They're 60 by 80. They're like that.
You said you still work.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Are those?
Oh, yeah, they're still 14 by 11. As a matter of fact, there's one that I just did that was just, it's called the Yellow River. And it's all a moss green painting of China's Yellow River. But it's done in just motion like this. And all of a sudden, I stopped and I looked at it and said, why, that's the Yellow River that I saw in 1989. So I stopped. But so they're still abstract, but you see, I mean, you do see it. It's not impossible. Yes? What?
That your paintings reminds me, in this conversation, that global warming is actually the Earth just doing its thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that we are the ones who are all upset about it.
Right. That's what Robert Stavens was saying.
Yeah.
Nature is indifferent.
It got me thinking. I mean, I think a lot about this problem and have done so for a number of years, but it's astonishing really to be reminded of that realization that the Earth is going to do just fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yep.
us, we're going to run out of water.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll run out of being a species as a result of that in the future. So another reason to live in the present. Yes.
You seem to be tuned into like the rhythm of nature. Do you paint rhythmically?
I do. I paint. It's interesting. We've had a little bit of that conversation in my opening. I paint with music. Sometimes I put on the opera, and other times I have jazz, and other times I have Sarah Bareilles, her new album called Chaos. What is it called? I think it's called Amidst the Chaos. It's an amazing article. I mean, amazing group of songs. Yeah, so I do. Music is, I should have mentioned that, music is key to all of this because it's movement. And what is life without movement, right? We know that. All right. I think we've done it.